All right. Well, welcome to Treeline. If you're new here, my name is David. I'm one of the pastors here, and I get a chance to teach the Bible. And here's one of the things, I don't know if you felt this way. Isn't it amazing all of those iconic scenes are in the same passage? Did you feel that way? I remember reading this passage, and I was like, wait, this is in here? Wait, this is in here? This is in here too? And I remember thinking like, oh my goodness, like packed with iconic moments, okay? Right, and one of the first ones, Jesus puts a child in the middle and says, hey, unless you're become like little children, you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. Like, that's iconic, right? Like, even if you're not, someone who goes to church, you're like, yeah, I think Jesus did that at one point. Like, you kind of have some familiarity with it. Or anyone, causes one of these little ones to sin. It's better if a millstone were like hung around their neck and drowned in the sea. Like, iconic, terrifying, okay? We'll talk about that. You've got the gouge out your eye verse, right? Like, even if you're not a Christian, you're like, I've heard of that, right? Like, Christians are supposed to do that, but haven't. So what's going on there? Then Jesus leaving the 99 to go in search of the one. There's like 10 sermons here. And actually, this is how most Christians approach these verses. And I would say that's actually how I've approached these verses. Kind of you take little pieces of it and you kind of look at it on their own. But what's very interesting is Matthew wants us to look at all of this in one piece. Like, all of this is one response to this question the disciples have: who is the greatest? And I'll be honest, this week, all week, was me trying to figure out, how do all of these things work together? Because it feels kind of rambly, doesn't it? He's like, here's a child, and then he's like, and don't cause this little one to sin. It'll be very bad for you. And don't sin. You shouldn't sin either. And then the sheep thing, like, it just kind of, it feels like it kind of wanders around. And so all week I've been trying to figure out, how do all of these things work together? Because Matthew's trying to make it clear this isn't just like a collection of different teachings of Jesus. Like, there's some sections of the Bible that are like that. It's like, Jesus said this, he also said this, he also said this. But here, Matthew's saying, no. Jesus said all of this in kind of one consistent thematic answer to this question: who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So that's their question. They come to Jesus and they ask that question. And what Jesus does, the way he begins to answer this, is really this profound moment. And so I just want us to kind of picture this scene with Jesus, right? They ask this question: Jesus, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And it says what Jesus does is he looks around, and he might even have to, has a little bit of time finding, but he calls to him a child. So he puts this little kid in the middle of the circle, and this feels like a powerful question, right? And so all of a sudden there's a child standing there, and Jesus basically points to this child and says, hey, you're wondering who is the greatest, and I'm telling you there's actually a significant problem, because actually if you don't figure out how to become like children, you can't even enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's like, you're worrying about greatness, but I'm saying that if you don't figure out something to become like this child, you won't even enter it. And then he says that whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest. And so he's like, hey, you want a hierarchy? Okay, here it is. Whoever like humbles himself the most, like this child, that's the greatest. And so here's a question. What does this mean? Like, what does that mean? Because it's a really iconic moment. It's profound. And even like as we say it today, we're like, oh man, like what a very interesting illustration for Jesus to give. But I think it's also confusing, right? It's like, what does that necessarily mean? And how we interpret this passage is actually pretty important. It's not something we should just move past quickly and be like, wonder what that means. No, Jesus says if we don't become like children, we will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So it's a weighty thing. Like, we need to figure out what this means. And a lot of people have put a lot of thought into this. And it's very interesting. Most people, if you read the commentaries or you kind of read, the theologians, a lot of them will say something like this, that Jesus is kind of pointing to this like childlike innocence, right? Children are kind of maybe pure, or maybe children like very trusting, like they're just very trusting of those who are in authority over them. Or one commentary just says children are untempted by self-advancement. And one of the things you realize very quickly is that most everyone who's tried to answer this way, it feels like they've never seen a child, okay? Because none of these things are true at all. Like, the idea that children wouldn't be tempted by social advancement or like their place in the hierarchy, anybody that's ever seen children are like, oh, that's not true at all. Like, if I pick one of my kids and put them on my lap, immediately the other one from far off the house would like sense it and be like, oh my gosh, and would like run towards me and try to wedge themselves in between the other child on my lap. They're actually always trying to figure out who is the best, who is first. And some people talk about like the purity or innocence of childhood. That's like almost like a popular thing today, you know? It's like children, like they're so pure. And it feels like it's written by English professors that have written about children so much they've never actually had time to see any. So, I mean, really, it does. Like, you read this stuff and you're like, what are you talking about? Like, this is just not true. There are a lot of things we lose when we grow old. And it's very interesting. The Bible never holds up childishness as a virtue, but consistently it holds up childlikeness as there's something there. There's something about being a child that Jesus and other passages kind of point to and say, we lost something when we grew old. But this passage, there's actually a very specific thing Jesus is trying to point to. And he doesn't leave it abstract for us. He actually says it very specific. Look at verse 4. He says, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So that's what the illustration is for. He's saying this. Children are humble. And not in the sense that children don't think much about themselves, because we've already covered that they do, right? But in the sense that society doesn't think much of them. Society doesn't think much of them. They're culturally insignificant. And children today, that's not really true, right? We kind of have this, the children, there's something magical about children. They run around and we're like, oh, how sweet. And even if, you know, if like Indy came and like ran through here during the sermon, you'd all be like, oh, that's so cute. Like, it's so fun. I'd be like, what are you doing? Get out of here. But everyone else would be like, that's so cute, right? We have this idea that kids are wonderful, but culturally, that wasn't how people viewed kids. Actually, children were like actually seriously looked down upon. It wasn't a position that anyone admired or valued, and those who were children were very clearly waiting to be adults. And the reason was because they wanted to become something. They wanted to be able to make something of their lives. And so to be a child was to be somebody that just had no social status whatsoever. It is to be insignificant. And so Jesus brings into the middle of this whole crowd a child. And there's nothing else to note about them. We're not told their name. We're not told anything about them. And that's the point. Jesus brings into the middle of this group of people who are asking, who is the greatest? And Jesus essentially takes something or someone of no significance, puts it in the middle, a nobody, and says, hey, unless you become like this, you can't even enter the kingdom of heaven. If you want to be great in the kingdom, then you have to lose this desire for status and significance. You need to become a nobody. And herein lies the great problem for us in our discipleship. The very thing that Jesus says we need to even enter the kingdom, the thing that makes people great in the kingdom, seems to be the thing that we are allergic to the most. The idea of being a nobody. The idea of being insignificant, of not being noticed, being looked over. Isn't this like the one thing that is intolerable to us? Maybe you don't feel that way, but I feel that way. And I think that for many of us in the room, we can sort of have like a chuckle, like the disciples in this moment, right? Because they're asking Jesus, who is the greatest in the kingdom? They're essentially like saying, the translation is this: hey, Jesus, which one of us is the best? Like that's literally like if that was the translation, it'd be like a good translation of what they're asking. And I think that we can sort of look at the disciples and say, oh, you silly, silly boys, fighting over who is best. And they do this again and again, right? And you can kind of almost laugh at them from this place of distance. But C.S. Lewis, in his chapter on pride in his book, Mere Christianity, it's an amazing book if you haven't read it. But he says pride is very interesting because it's the one thing that human beings kind of despise the most when they see it in other people, right? Like when someone comes into like a party or even online, you see someone kind of posturing and it's just like there's kind of this arrogance bleeding off them. It's very easy for us to just be like, I hate that, right? Can't stand it. It's so easy for us to judge others and despise people when we see it in them. But he also says, and yet it's the thing we have the hardest time seeing in ourselves. And this is what he says. He says, if you want to find out how proud you are, the easiest way is to simply ask yourself, how much do I dislike it when other people cheat me? or refuse to take any notice of me or patronize me or show off. So, how much do you hate it? When other people like show off or they one up, you're at a party and you're sharing a story and someone's like, well, here's my story and it's just better than yours, right? Like, how much do you not like that? And he says, well, the point is that each person's pride is in competition with everyone else's pride. You see, it's because I wanted to be the big noise at the party and I'm so annoyed by someone else being the big noise. Now, he says this, what I want to get clear is that pride is essentially competitive. It's competitive by its very nature. While the other voices are competitive only, so to speak, by accident, pride gets no pleasure in just having something, only of having more of it than the next man. I mean, how many of our lives are like this, right? We think, well, if I could just get this much money for my next promotion, then I'd be fine. But all of a sudden you realize, no, I actually need a little more because the person I live next to, they now have a nice car. And we just kind of compare to other people. And so the disciples, they say the quiet thing out loud, and they just say, Jesus, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? You see what's happening is the disciples are trying to smuggle their pride into their discipleship. And they're saying, yes, we've left behind fishing and tax collecting and all those things we used to kind of measure ourselves by. We're part of the kingdom of Jesus now. So our question is, how do we get to the top of this thing? How do we get to the top? How do we become great here? And what's interesting is right before this, there's two kind of events that happened. One, Jesus' glory is revealed on top of a mountain, Mount Transfiguration, Matthew 17. So his glory is revealed, this veil is kind of ripped open in our kind of time space, and Jesus' glory is revealed on top of this mountain to the disciples. And then right after this, he makes it clear that he's going to be headed to a cross to be killed. And it's in the shadow of those two things that the disciples want to have a conversation about how great they are. You see, one of the problems with pride is it keeps our eyes on ourselves and those around us. And in doing so, it keeps us from looking above us. It keeps us from really seeing God. So this is just an amazing moment. I just think it's like Jesus' glory is being revealed. He's going to a cross. He says that. And the disciples are so focused on themselves that they're not even able to see that. And so they just come to Jesus and they just go like, yes, that's fine. You're great. You're whatever. But what about us? What about our greatness? And here's what's interesting. When you ask the question, who is great in this world? There's a ton of ways to answer that question, right? You're going to the University of Michigan and be like, well, here's who's great. Whoever ascends the hill and gets to this place on the football team, that person's great. Or if you get this kind of grades and you get this kind of scholarship and have this kind of degree, that's how you're great. Or you go to the business and you eventually get to the CEO spot, that's how you're great. What's so interesting is that in the kingdom of heaven, there's one great person. His name is Jesus, and he's the one man with scars on his body, and the rest of us are just supposed to be gathered together at the foot of the cross. And the ground at the foot of the cross is supposed to be level, where all of us are just standing empty-handed, looking up at the one who has bought and paid for our salvation. And yet, if you walk into a church, isn't it this game of comparisons where all of us are still trying to find some way to build some kind of box we can stand on so we might be a little bit above the person next to us? And Jesus is basically saying here, like, man, it's really not supposed to be that way. You want to be great in the kingdom? Here, be like this child. Be somebody who is just insignificant. Become a nobody. Don't try to become someone of stature or significance. Just be a nobody. And look what he says next in verse 5. He says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. So he's kind of continuing this idea, but he starts to change it. And he says, whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it'd be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world for temptations to sin, for it is necessary that temptations come, but woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. This is an intense passage. Anyone just feel like wow, okay. This is an intense passage, and I actually think the translation here, this is the ESV. We teach from the ESV. It's a really good translation. It tries to get it just very like, this is what it says in the Greek, a pretty close translation. But I actually think this translation does us a bit of a disservice here. I don't know what your Bible said. You might have a different translation. Most of the translations say something a little bit different. But I've always thought this meant something like this. Hey, if you tempt one of these little ones, like specifically a kid, like if you entice them to sin with you, he's like, this is a really bad idea, and God's going to punish you, right? That's kind of how I kind of viewed this. You'd be like, if you go and be like, hey, let's steal this thing together. Jesus is like, don't do that, right? But there's a few different ways this is translated. Sin literally means, in like the Greek, it means to stumble. Or like the temptations to sin just means stumbling blocks. Like that's the actual translation. And so a lot of other places, because of the context, we translate the sin, like to stumble, to fall off course, right? But the context of this, I actually think a better way to translate it is like this. Whoever receives one of these kind of nobodies, like a little child, in my name really receives me, but whoever creates an obstacle, whoever gets in the way, whoever becomes a stumbling block to one of these little ones who believes in me, it would be better if a millstone, like a giant block, were tied around their neck and they were drowned in the sea. And see, I think the first reading of this, it basically means like whoever would just pull someone away to sin. And I think that's a possible reading. But I think what Jesus is actually talking about in the context is saying this. He's saying when pride is allowed to flourish in the church, it doesn't just keep us from rightly seeing God. It also keeps us from welcoming those God intends to welcome into his family. You see, what ends up happening is pride is in the world, and when that gets into the church, it turns into self-righteousness, which turns into barriers that keep people from being welcomed into the thing Jesus is trying to welcome them into. And so you have these people, these little ones, right? And these little ones are basically people of insignificance, they're kind of nobodies. Like they do not have any religious or righteous accolades to their name. The only thing they have is they know Jesus, right? They're like, just in the name of Jesus, I want to approach. I believe that's possible. And then what Jesus is saying is he's saying, if you make this about your greatness, what will end up happening is you will stand here next to God and you'll say, oh, no, you cannot approach because you're not like this. And what Jesus is saying is he's saying, I'm telling you, if you use your righteousness as like some obstacle to keep other people from approaching the throne, it would be better if that thing became like a stone hung around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. Like Jesus is so serious about this. He's so serious about this. You know, I think a lot of people, because this is a barrier that's in the church, a lot of people feel this way. And maybe you're here today and you haven't been in church for a long time, and actually that's how you feel. You feel like there are some people who, because of their righteousness and their holiness, they're very, very close to God. And it's felt your whole life like they've kind of held out an arm and said, I am close to God and you are not. You're not the kind of person that can approach God. I just want to say, I am sorry that's happened to you. Jesus says that will happen, but the thing he pronounces is woes upon the person who lives that way. So he says, woe to the world for these stumbling blocks. And he's not saying woe to the world because of how many temptations there are in it. There's other passages of the Bible that say something like that, but that's not what this is talking about. No, he's saying the world isn't like a bad place that can lead you astray. He's actually having sympathy on the world. He's saying the world is a bad place, like woe upon the world because of how many barriers there are to people being welcomed into the arms of God. He's saying, look, these stumbling blocks, these barriers are going to be there, but woe to the one from whom they come. He's like pronouncing woes, not on the whole world, because they might entice some Christians to go live like them. He's actually pronouncing woes on people like us who might live in such a way that we become obstacles to people coming to Jesus. And you say Jesus' goal in our lives is actually to humble us to the point that we would look at every single one in the world and think, of course that person could come to heaven with me. Of course they could. What difference is there between me and them? I'm a nobody, I'm insignificant, so are they. Of course they can come, because you see, humble people, they welcome others in as they have been welcomed in. Christopher Ashe, he's at Cambridge, he's at the kind of Tyndale House. He's a resident scholar there, and this is what he says, it's only when I turn and I actually believe that I am a nobody will my life truly be open to other nobodies. And this actually, I think, changes the way we read this next section. Okay, look at verse 8. These words might feel familiar to you, but I hope in the context they might come off a little different. And if your hand or your foot causes you to sin or to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out and throw it away. For it's better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into the hell of fire. So if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. There's a number of ways we can apply these verses, all right? And you maybe have heard them before, and I think most of my life I've kind of approached these verses as something like this. It's like, you know, like if my hand like wants to steal something, like if I just have this constant thing in me that wants to like go and steal something for myself, he's like, it'd be better for you to cut it off than to consistently be led astray, or like eyes, right? I mean, this is like a pretty common way we've approached this, right? Like if your eye causes you to sin, and so some people have said like if you can't figure out lust, it'd be better for you to just pluck them out, because at the very least, like you might go to heaven instead of just leading you astray. But in the context of this, it seems what Jesus is talking about is actually pride. See, in the context, what he's saying is this. He's saying, even if there is a very integral and important part of us, like an eye, a hand, a foot, something that's like so important to who we are, and even if that thing should cause us to look highly on ourselves and down at others, and thus cause us to stumble and keep us from entering the kingdom, he said it would be better if you'd actually cut that part off of us and enter into heaven even maimed than for that part to become a stumbling block to us that would keep us from entering life, from us from becoming these kind of nobodies, or for us to use that to actually keep others from entering eternal life. You see, it's quite clear that Jesus is being very serious here. And I think there's moments where it's like, we should pay attention to everything Jesus says, but there's certain moments where he's like, hey, truly, like I'm saying something to you that is serious and weighty and true. And we need to clue in. They're incredibly strong words. And most people that I know don't take these words from Jesus seriously at all. We just don't. We just kind of go, don't know what that means, and move on. But I know a few people who've taken it really seriously. I know a few people who've taken this very seriously, and I know people who've taken their phones and like chucked them off bridges because they just can't seem to not sin with their phone. I knew a guy in college who took his laptop, like it literally had all of his homework, it had everything that he needed on it, and yet he could not stop looking at porn on it. And so what he did is he took it and he chucked it out his dorm window, and it shattered on the ground. And that went down as like a legend in Salt Company forever, because it was like, I don't even know if that's the right way to apply that text, but that is amazing. Like, that is amazing what you did. And later he was like, I don't even know what classes I'm supposed to go to. It just, everything that he had that was of value was right here. And yet he was like, I don't care. I'm getting rid of this. I want life. So I've seen people do profound things like that because of this passage, but I have heard of very, very few people who saw something in their life that was causing them pride, something that was making them feel significant and important, and act against it with the same level of seriousness. And yet that's what Jesus is talking about. That's the thing he's saying. If this is causing you to stumble, it'd be better for you to cut it off, cut it out of your life, get rid of it, burn it down, get rid of this thing than for this thing you have pride in to keep you from being this insignificant nobody that actually inherits the kingdom of heaven. So who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? You see, when I hear the disciples answer or ask this question, and Jesus places this like little kid in front of them and says, you have to become a nobody. You have to humble yourself. I don't find myself standing in the crowd pointing at the foolishness of the disciples. I actually find myself in this scene standing with the disciples asking the exact same question. You see, my pride and my desire to be great, and even in my most vulnerable moments, if I'm honest with you, my desire to be better than others, it is something that to one degree or another has marked my whole life. I remember when I was in high school was the point when my dad started to talk to me very seriously about my pride. And I remember one day he just sat me down and he had like a very front door honest conversation with me about it. He just said, like, David, I see a lot of really amazing things in your life. I love you a ton. I'm so proud of you. But there is this thing in your life that I see growing and taking over you that wants to destroy you. I see a lot of pride in your life. And I remember when my dad first told me this, my response was honestly pretty quick. I just kind of thought about it and I was like, I don't see it. I don't think you're right, which is a really great illustration that he was right. But I remember he said this to me in this moment, but he kept coming back. And it was like 6 months later, he had the same conversation. He said, David, I love you. I care about you. I'm proud of you, but I see pride in your life. You have to deal with this or it's going to destroy you. Came back a year later and this became a consistent, regular thing. It wasn't an everyday thing he just beat me down with, but it was this like loving, intentional, put his hand on my shoulder saying, David, I see this in you. And this is going to destroy you if you don't figure out how to destroy it. And every time my dad said this, I felt the same way. I just don't see it. And it wasn't until my sophomore year of college when I finally realized just how deep and how serious this issue was in my life. And here's the moment that I realized my pride. I'd actually been following Jesus for about a year and a half at this point. Like I'd come to know him and my whole life had changed. I mean, my life did a 180. Everything flipped and changed. Started to follow Jesus. But somehow in the midst of all of this, it became clear that it was still really all about me. I was still really just thinking about building a name for myself. I was still focused on building my kingdom. You see, I had chosen to follow Jesus, but I hadn't let go of wanting to be great. And I felt like in this season, I started to see for the very first time the thing my dad kept pointing out in my life. There was something in me that even if I filled my life with Christian things, there was still something in me that unless it died, was going to keep me from receiving everything Jesus was trying to give me. And I had a very profound season of repentance in my life. One of the most serious ways I've tried to just kill sin in my life was my sophomore year of college, where this was revealed to me. And I just took very serious action against my pride. And I didn't even know what to do at first. I was just like, I don't know how to not be this way. I've only been this way. I only know how to be this way. But I saw it in my life and Jesus put his finger on it. And it was like, this has to go. And so I just simply tried to do the things Jesus was telling me to do. I tried to turn away from this path I was on, to repent of it, and to try to do what he says, to try to actually humble myself. And I did this very intentionally. There were things in my life I would do because I was trying to elevate myself. And I started to ask the question, what is the opposite of that? Right? Oh, this is the seat you take if you want everyone to look at you at the dinner party. How can I sit in some obscure place no one will notice me? Like I just started to ask that question. I started to try to pursue that path. Oh, this is the throne. How about I take the seat down here where no one will see me? I tried to do what Jesus says, and a lot has changed in my life then. Many moments of repentance, many moments of like turning away from this thing in me, like this passage says, but this thing in me that desires to be great, to have first place, to be important, is still in me. Like it's still there. I still feel it. And over the years, as I've tried to become the person Jesus is describing, I've had these moments where I really did feel like a nobody. Like I really felt in those moments totally and completely okay with being insignificant. And I had these moments where I stopped thinking about myself because my eyes and my hands and my feet were actually so focused on God. I wasn't thinking much of myself, but I also wasn't thinking little of myself. I just wasn't thinking about myself at all because I was just enamored with Jesus, not me. And I'm telling you, those really have been the best moments in my life. The moments where my pride and my ego just kind of got pushed so far away, it just wasn't there. And I just really felt like I was humble and not like lowly, but I just didn't care about myself anymore because I was so enthralled by the one who loved me. Those have been the best moments of my life. C.S. Lewis, in the same chapter, he says this. He says, we need to be careful not to think that pride is something God forbids because he's just offended at it, or that humility is something he demands as due his own dignity, as if God himself was proud. He says he's not the least worried about his dignity. The point is this: he wants you to know him, and he wants to give you himself. And he and you are two things of such a kind that if you really get into any kind of touch with him, you will in fact be humble. He says delightedly humble. He's saying if you have this moment where you actually have a connection with the God who is so far above you, like he is creator, you are creature, like we are not the same kind. He's saying if you have a moment of connection with God, in that moment you will be humble. And he says you'll be delightedly humble, feeling the infinite relief of having for once got rid of all the silly nonsense about your own dignity, which has made you restless and unhappy your whole life. Do you want that? Like, I know there's part of us that is like, no, I really do want to be great. But I'm saying, do you want to be free of that desire you always have to be something and make something of your life and matter? That you just be content, at peace, filled with joy regardless of your status and your group or your community or online, just at peace. You see, when Jesus says, follow me, this is one of the things he's inviting us into. Humility. And this is one of the greatest problems with discipleship I've found, is that when we meet Jesus, this moment in our lives where we meet him, we see him clearly, we're like, I know who Christ is. We find that he is headed in the opposite direction that we are. It's almost like if you view the world like a ladder, and we, from the moment we are born, we are just climbing like the next rung, and oftentimes we get just beat down, and we feel like I haven't even gotten off the bottom rung, but like our whole goal is to climb up this thing. And some of us here have done a really good job. We're actually getting near the place we think, maybe if I get there, I can finally be happy. And the thing that happens is we meet Jesus somewhere along this journey. And we meet him. And maybe we're amazed by him. We're compelled by him. We're like, this is incredible. Like, this man is absolutely amazing. I want to spend my entire life with him. And then you say, let's go, Jesus. And you start climbing a little bit higher. And he says, oh, no, that's not the direction I'm going. No, I'm going down. We're going down. That's where we're going. You're my disciple. This is where I'm headed. I'm inviting you to follow me. Have you ever had that moment in your life, not just where you decide to follow Jesus, but you actually intentionally, specifically have said, I want to follow Jesus in humility. I want to follow Jesus away from status and somethingness towards being a nobody, being okay with being someone so insignificant that they would just be hung on a cross between two criminals, stripped of everything that they ever had. Have you ever had that moment where you've actually looked at that posture of life, the humility, the nobodiness of that, and said, I actually want that. I want to be okay with that. I want to be humble, not lifted up. See, there's this moment where we meet Jesus, and Jesus is heading down the ladder. He is climbing down. The question is, will we join him? Will we join him? And this is the thing that's happening in this moment is because Jesus' disciples are realizing they're still trying to figure out how they can climb up. And Jesus says, that's not how this works. We're going down. Will we follow him? Look how he ends this in verse 10. He says, see that you do not despise one of these little ones. You could basically say, see that you do not despise one of these nobodies, these kind of insignificant ones. For I tell you that in heaven, their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these nobodies, these little ones, these insignificants, it's not my will that one of these should perish. You see, to follow Jesus down the ladder, to humble ourselves, to let go of the things we feel give our lives significance and status, even to be like ruthless with those things. Like what Jesus says, like to cut them off, even though they feel so significant and important to us. These are hard things. Following Jesus at times is actually very hard. But they're easier when we realize that the one we're following down the ladder, even nobodies are significant to him. You see, what's fascinating about this whole passage is the theme that runs through all of it is Jesus is saying, those who are insignificant in this world and have no status, those who are humble and lowly, I defend them with everything I have. I run after them with everything in me. I will leave the 99 to go after one that's considered so insignificant, no one noticed they were gone. I noticed because I care. Even nobodies are significant to him. Francis Schaeffer, he says it like this. He says, the choice that Jesus is putting before us is this. We will either be humbled now before the face of the world, or we will be humbled on the day when we stand before the face of Jesus. If one has not humbled themselves in this life, then they will be humbled then. There is no third way. So, we will be humbled. We will be lowly. We will be the insignificant nobodies. Jesus is saying here that the question is, who will we be insignificant nobodies to? Will it be before the face of the world? Will we be humbled now in this life? Or when we meet Jesus face to face, will that be the moment of our humbling? I'm telling you, I don't want that to be the day I'm humbled. I don't want to be humbled in that day. I want it to be today. When I see Jesus face to face, I don't want the first words he says to me is, I don't know you. I don't want that to be what he says to me. What I want him to say to me is the thing he says in the rest of Scripture, that those who are insignificant nobodies, but they put their faith in Jesus, those who've said no to the things of this world, who followed him down the ladder, he picks those people up and says, come with me. I don't want to be humbled on that day. I don't want you to be humbled on that day. But what Jesus is saying we have to do is through his grace and through his kindness, we have to become humble. We have to humble ourselves. And Jesus says that through his grace, we actually can. Let me pray.